Imagine being the first person in your entire family to own a house. Not rent one, not finance one for 30 years, not move into one because someone handed you the keys, but actually walk through the front door knowing you paid for every brick yourself. For most people, that sounds like a fantasy, but for you, it started somewhere much smaller. It started with a kid sitting in a house that never really felt like home. You remember the little things, the peeling paint, the old furniture, the kitchen table that had been there for as long as you could remember, and the conversations your parents tried to have quietly about bills, about rent, about whether there would be enough left at the end of the month. You didn't understand everything back then, but you understood one thing. Money controlled the room, and you hated that. When you were 8 years old, you didn't know what a mortgage was. You didn't understand interest rates. You didn't know what property taxes were. You didn't know how much a house cost. You just knew that some families had a place they could call theirs, and you wanted that. You wanted a front door that couldn't be taken away, a bedroom that didn't belong to a landlord, a kitchen where your mother could cook without worrying about the next rent payment. You didn't know it yet, but that little dream would follow you for decades. As you got older, you began to understand why your parents struggled. They worked, they sacrificed, they did everything they could. But working hard doesn't automatically make you wealthy. Sometimes you're simply trying to survive, and you watched it happen. Paycheck, bills, rent, food, utilities, repeat. There was never enough room to breathe. So somewhere along the way, you made yourself a promise. One day, this ends with me. Not because you thought you were better than your parents, because you loved them. You wanted to build something they never had the opportunity to build. Your first job didn't make you rich. Neither did your second. You weren't driving an expensive car. You weren't wearing designer clothes. You weren't posting screenshots of your bank account online. You were doing something much less exciting. You were saving, a little at a time. While everyone else was spending their money trying to look successful, you were quietly trying to become successful. You learned to say no. No to things you didn't need. No to expensive weekends. No to constantly upgrading your phone. No to buying things just because everyone else had them. And every time you said no, your future got a little bigger. There were years when nothing seemed to happen. You worked, you saved, you invested carefully, you learned. Then you did it again, month after month, year after year. Nobody applauded you for it. Nobody saw the nights you checked your bank account. Nobody saw you cancel plans because you had a bigger goal. Nobody knew why you were so careful with money. Some people probably thought you were cheap. Others probably thought you were afraid to enjoy life. They didn't understand. You weren't trying to avoid living. You were trying to buy yourself freedom. Eventually, something changed. Your income increased. Your savings increased. Your investments started working alongside you. And for the first time, the number in your account became large enough to change your life. But you still didn't celebrate, because you remembered where you came from. You remembered the old kitchen, the conversations about bills, the feeling of watching your parents worry about money. You weren't saving for a Lamborghini. You weren't saving for a mansion. You were saving for a door that would finally belong to your family. Then one Saturday morning, you started looking. House after house, street after street. Some were too expensive. Some needed too much work. Some looked beautiful online and completely different in person. But eventually, you found it. It wasn't the biggest house. It wasn't the most luxurious. It wasn't some celebrity mansion. It was simply home. You walked through the front door, looked around, and something inside you became quiet. You could see your parents sitting in the living room. You could see family dinners. You could see birthdays. You could see ordinary mornings. You weren't buying square footage. You were buying memories that hadn't happened yet. Then came the hardest part. You looked at the price, and you looked at your savings. For years, that money had represented security. Walking away from it was terrifying, because suddenly, the number would become zero. Not literally zero, but close enough to feel it. You could have kept investing. You could have waited. You could have bought something cheaper. But you knew what this house meant, so you made the decision. You were going to buy it with cash. The day finally arrived. You sat across the table from people you had never met. Documents were placed in front of you. Pages, signatures, numbers, initials, one signature after another. And then, the final page. You put the pen down, and suddenly, it was yours. No 30-year mortgage hanging over your head. No monthly payment waiting for you. No landlord. No fear that someone could decide not to renew your lease. Just a house, paid for. By you. Then someone placed the keys in your hand. They were tiny, almost insignificant, but you stared at them longer than you expected. Because those keys represented years. Years of work. Years of saying no. Years of patience. Years nobody else saw. And suddenly, you realized something. You had become the first person in your family to do this. You didn't just buy a house. You had changed the story. You didn't know exactly how your parents would react, so you simply told them. You bought a house, and it was paid for. Your mother went quiet. Your father stared at you. For a moment, nobody said anything. Then your mother asked, "You mean it's really yours?" You nodded, and your father looked around the room, not because he was impressed by the house, but because he understood what it represented. His son had done something he had spent his entire life believing was almost impossible. The first night in the house was strangely quiet. There were still boxes everywhere. The rooms weren't completely furnished. The walls didn't have family photographs yet, but you didn't care. You walked through every room, slowly. You touched the walls, looked through the windows, opened doors, and eventually you stood in the middle of the living room, alone, and smiled. Because for the first time in your life, you weren't borrowing someone else's space. You were standing inside something you had built. A few days later, your parents came over. You sat around the dining table. The food wasn't fancy, the plates weren't expensive. Nothing about the evening looked like a millionaire lifestyle. And that's exactly what made it perfect. Your mother was laughing, your father was telling an old story, and you were sitting there thinking, "This is why I did it. Not for the house, for this." At some point, you looked around the room, and you remembered being a teenager, sitting at that old family table, listening to your parents talk about money. Back then, you couldn't help them. You were just a kid, you couldn't change anything. But now, you could. And maybe that's what success really is. Not proving that you're better than the people who came before you, but becoming strong enough to give them something they never had. One afternoon, you planted a tree in the backyard. It was small, barely more than a young sapling, but you knew it wouldn't stay that way forever. Years from now, it would be taller, stronger. Its roots would be deeper. And maybe someday, someone would stand beneath its branches and have no idea who planted it. That thought made you smile, because that's what a legacy is. You don't build it so everyone remembers your name. You build it so someone else's life can be better because you existed. The next morning, sunlight entered through your bedroom window. You opened the curtains, looked outside, and realized something strange. There was no rent due, no landlord, no 30-year payment schedule, no fear of having to leave. Just your house, your keys, your life. And for the first time, you understood what financial freedom actually felt like. It wasn't luxury, it was peace. You looked at the house. Then, you thought about the kid you used to be. The kid who didn't understand money. The kid who simply wanted a safe place for his family. And somehow, that kid's dream had survived. Through bad decisions, through difficult years, through sacrifices, through uncertainty. It survived, and eventually, you carried it across the finish line. People might look at your house and see an asset, a property, a number, a piece of real estate. But you see something completely different. You see your mother's smile, your father's silence, the old kitchen, the worn table, the bills, the sacrifices, the years. You see every version of yourself that had to exist before this moment became possible. And that's why the house means so much. Because the house isn't the achievement. You are. Maybe your children will grow up differently. Maybe they'll never understand what it felt like to worry about rent. Maybe they'll take stability for granted. And honestly, that's okay. Because someone has to be the first. Someone has to break the cycle. Someone has to take the first step. And sometimes, that person is you. That evening, you stood outside your house. Your parents were beside you. The sun was disappearing behind the horizon. You held the keys in your hand, and you looked at the house one more time. It wasn't a mansion. It wasn't perfect, but it was yours. And more importantly, it belonged to a family that had spent generations trying to get here. You weren't just the first person in your family to buy a house with cash. You were the first person to prove that the story could change. And maybe that's the real meaning of wealth. Not having the most, but being the person who finally has enough to give the people you love something they never had. A place to stay, a place to grow, a place to come home to. And when you finally walk through that front door,